Yes, Bapin Malik, you can start now.
Okay. Am I audible? Is it okay?
Yes, yes, perfectly fine.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you once again, Hassan. So this is first of all a very good evening to all. This is Bapin Maulik. I'm an assistant professor as well as head Department of English, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College, Betai, Noida, West Bengal. And on behalf of BASE, Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, Gaur Mahavidyalaya, which is affiliated to University of Gaur Bongo, Ambedkar Center for Cultural Studies, and the Department of English, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College, I heartily welcome you all to this free day, a virtual conference, as you know, belonging and homelessness. And in today's session, in this particular session, we are going to explore the topic that is the concept of minority. As you know, that the concept of minority developed in the field of political science in the rise of nationalism in Europe, particularly during the 19th century. And it was associated with, at that time, it was associated with national minorities in heterogeneous nation states. But during the first of the 20th century, and of course, in the post-human world, in the post-modern world, this particular concept, this concept of minority, encompasses different groups of people who are exploited, sometimes through the process of consent or sometimes through the process of coercion. And this politics of exclusion, this politics of denial that is executed on the basis of, as we know, on the basis of caste, on the basis of religion, on the basis of ethnicity, language, and so on. And for this particular topic is so important. And of course, in this particular session, plenary session 1, we are going to explore the topic that is idea of minority, a Laurellean reflection. And for the discussion on this topic, we have with us Dr. Prosenjit Biswas. Dr. Prosenjit Biswas is a thinker of alternatives within continental philosophy. He teaches philosophy at Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, India. His last published work, that is between philosophy and anthropology, Aporias of Thought, Language, and Consciousness, that was published from Notion Press, Chennai, in 2017. His areas of interest include phenomenology and continental philosophy, philosophy of mind, philosophy of tribes of Northeast India. So, without any further delay, I would like to invite our speaker, Dr. Prosenjit Biswas, and I hope and I am sure about the fact that this particular lecture, which is going to be delivered today, the idea of minority, a Laurellean reflection, definitely it will raise some important issues which are associated with our contemporary world. And of course, this particular lecture will play a very crucial role in order to give some possible solution to all these problems. So, without any further delay, I would like to hand over this virtual space to our speaker, Dr. Prosenjit Biswas. Sir, over to you.
Uh, Thank you very much, Bapan Mulli. I'm deeply indebted to the forum called BASE because I have been following it since its very inception. My very dear friend Abid Hussain is the catalyst behind my coming here and behind speaking to all of you. The whole purpose of BASE, as I understand from its very inception, is to re-understand, redescribe the hierarchically divided social worlds of Bengal and beyond in terms of the social categories, especially categories which are exclusivist and which exclude a vital segment of people in the name of describing some kind of victimhood, some kind of minorityhood to them. Describing minorityhood is something which is part of the larger process of state building. That's my first proposition, that a modern state builds around a notion of minorityhood. It really doesn't build around the notion of a majorityhood. And that's the very, very kind of important kind of departure from the usual understanding of a majority minority binary that operates through the social hierarchies, the modes and methods of social differentiation, and which finds its expression in our linguistic categorization of a variety of subject positions in terms of caste, class, religion, language, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that a kind of expressivism about the very notion of minority that goes beyond categorization of a minority, because an act of categorization is necessarily an act of differentia. It creates a kind of binary opposition between at least two necessary terms which are in a contrarian relationship. Therefore, any categorization as minority or majority is based on a binary opposition between at least two different terms who are drawn to a certain kind of difference, as if this difference is something ineliminable, as if this difference pervades through
हमको
the
बादाम
entire social space. Therefore, this kind of categorization in terms of minority or majority is something which is already embedded into a scheme of classification, a scheme of domination, a scheme of building and hegemony. Now, this way of looking at minority and majority is a perpetuation of the worldview of hegemony. It's a continuation of an imposed form of social differentiation, which really doesn't bring out the nature of the minority. It merely projects a certain idea of minority as opposed to an idea of majority. Now, these kind of projected dualisms and binary oppositions pervading through an artificial scheme of social differentiation is something that modern state heavily depends upon. And in modern period or under modernity, categorization as a form of drawing a distinction or creating a certain kind of social and cultural boundary and pushing that boundary to a certain space by expanding it or by shrinking it are all operations of the modern state system. So 2 points I'm making. At one level, the very construction of minority is based on a pejorative presupposition of a hierarchy. And at another level, the very operation of the term of minority is something which is part of a statist process of operating through artificial social and cultural boundaries. So therefore, what happens to the category minority is a certain kind of an already ascribed, value-laden, ascribed meaning that gives rise to a certain kind of a fixity, a certain kind of rigidification of the very notion of minority, and this notion is temporally, segmentally, or rather arbitrarily, often designed and redesigned in order to serve a certain purpose of the state. So therefore, a purposive rationality that creates a sense of hierarchy, that pervades an artificial sense of differentiation, are all that goes behind the very construction of a notion of minority as part of the modern hierarchical state system through which it operates its own hegemony. Now, this notion of minority is something pejorative. It is something based on certain presuppositions which are political, metaphysical, spiritual, moral, that fixes the contours of the notion of minority, and the very category of minority is not able to alleviate itself from this kind of a ordained conceptual scheme within which it is forced to operate, as opposed to this kind of a artificial, purposive, rational constitution of the notion of minority and creation of an enforced hierarchy. What is happening is a certain kind of segmentalization, a certain fragmentation of senses, a certain curtailment of the full potential of the very notion of minority into something that serves a pre-given, a preordained purpose, as opposed to that, this kind of a modernist, statist, and hierarchized notion of minority, which is also racist to a large extent because this absolutizes a certain kind of difference. And this absolutization results into a kind of self-awareness which is specific to a contemporary form of culturalism or a contemporary form of linguistic and cultural differentiation, is a certain kind of argument about cultural incompatibility, a kind of an asymmetric distribution of a sense of identity, which goes into an absolute sense of fixing who the minority is all about. So there is this one-sided cultural attribution and an asymmetric evaluation of a presupposed cultural incompatibility, which is bearing out an underlying logic of culturalism and which distinguishes itself from the possibility of any alternative. Therefore, there is an imaginary cultural aspect, a biological aspect, a racial aspect, and such other aspects that provide a certain disposition towards identifying a certain minority, which is once again part of a predisposition. Now, this kind of a predisposed notion of minority is based on a certain sense of primordialism, a primordialism that ascribes minorityhood on the other, on the supposed differential other, another who is grounded in some kind of an absolutist notion of race or culture. So therefore, a presupposed, predisposed notion of minority is culturalist, racist, biological, primordial, and it operates within the conceptual scheme of hierarchization, through which a modern state tries to presuppose a certain ground of legitimation for itself. So, ascribing minorityhood creates a ground of attributing an identity, a sense of being in a modern hierarchical state system, as opposed to this kind of a predisposed notion of minority. François Lowell, a French philosopher of great contemporary depth, had written this fantastic book, which I would propose to discuss here and would connect to a certain mode of social theorization about the social hierarchy that we experience in the context of our country, that is India, and especially in relation to Bengal and Bengali identity as such. So François Laurelle's book is entitled as A Biography of Ordinary Men, and it's subtitled as On Authorities and Minorities. That's it. Authorities and minorities as part of biography of ordinary man. So the ordinary man, is part of a certain kind of authority. An ordinary man is also a part of a predisposed notion of minority. And there is this kind of conversation that would bring together the notion of individual existence as well as a generalized existential notion of self-identity, where self is constituted by the other. So one moves from a sense of individuality to an existential sense of selfhood, which is constituted by an ascribed otherness. The otherness that is reproduced in the form of a minority. So without the minority other, the notion of an individualized self cannot be constituted. Mark here, I am not saying that without the notion of a minority other, the notion of a majority self cannot be constituted. I'm not saying that. I am saying the fundamental, the foundational, the ontological singularity of an individual self-constitution derives itself from an ascribed otherness of minorityhood. The minority other constitutes me, myself, and all my self-referring expressions arise from, and that's a very radical claim about minority, my self-referring expressions arise from my capacity to ascribe, or my ecosystem, my natural environment, rather my naturalized disposition to ascribe minorityhood to a certain other in absolute terms, in primordial terms, in soliciting a ground for my own being, for my own existence. And this is the very first notion of minority that François Loyal throws us. It's like we are thrown into the world because we are able to constitute a notion of minority, which in turn constructs and constitutes our self-identity. So you have this primary movement towards constituting an idea of minority. And this idea of minority finds an expression in the very self-identity or the individuality of a modern, cultural, biological, racist, communal, individual self. So therefore, there is an absence of a collective self here the moment we depend on our self-constitution, on the notion of ascribing minorityhood on another. So to put it in Hegelian terms, the self-other dialectic, or the reference to the very self, as a reference from other to the self, and not a reference from self to the other. It's a reference from the other to the self. The other who is an unknown and ascribed with the status of minority as part of a social hierarchy, as part of a predisposed cultural, biological grounding of my own self, finds its ground in a move from other to the self, by way of finding a ground for itself in the ascribed notion of minority. And this is what Lowell calls as an existential notion of self, which bases itself on the notion of an ascribed otherness of a minority. So the question comes back to you, then who is the minority? Is the minority the reflected notion of minority? Or is it a reflexive notion of self that bases itself on a reflected notion of minority? Well, the answer is that there is a certain kind of unreflectivity, a notion of unreflectivity in the ascription of being a minority, in terms of a race, in terms of an ascribed identity. And this unreflective, outward moving, ascribed notion of minority provides a ground for our self-identity. And therefore, the self that depends on an ascribed otherness to someone who is another and who is ascribed with the notion of minority. You can see here a certain kind of asymmetry, a certain discomfiture, a certain kind of pain, a sense of difference embedded in the very process of actualization of oneself by way of ascribing a notion of minorityhood on some other. Okay. And that's an argument that Laurel gives. And this description is unreflective. So Lowell conceptualized it in terms of a certain sense of remoteness, a certain sense of alignment, a certain kind of alignment to an ascribed notion of minority. And he draws a distinction between the being as such, and being in particular, or being in concrete. The concrete being is the being of the minority, and being as such is the original being of my finding a ground for myself. So being as such is me, while the concrete being is this ascribed minority. And this is something uneven, because the self and the other can never meet. They will have to perpetually differentiate themselves in a kind of remoteness, in a kind of remoteness, in a kind of irreconcilable thought about otherness of the minority. And therefore, Lowell will say that it's rather a kind of Cartesian kind of division that determines the fixing of the minority, and this fixing of the minority creates a sense of absence or a vanishing sense of being in oneself, because being that one is supposed to carry with oneself vanishes in the transcendental fixation about ascribed otherness of the minority. And therefore, minority as another is no longer a cultural fetish. Rather, it's culturally objectifiable as a contingent act of self-making. One can also say that it's an act of self-consciousness that moves towards an ascribed other, who once ascribed with the status of being a minority acts as the source of very being of oneself. And this is something very peculiar to the very nature of human, which Lowell considers as something like a very anthropological kind of a bias, a kind of an anthropological machine that produces the very difference between the self and the other. Can we come out of this anthropological machine of this difference between the self and the other? Is it possible to come out of the Eurocentric, Hellenistic notion of a Cartesian division between the self and the other? Is it something like a kind of auto-inhibition? Lowell points out. Is it something like an automated inhibition that doesn't allow us to come out of this Cartesian binary? Is it something which is conditioned by an external cause rather than its effect on oneself? Is it something like a vacant place that is meant for an ascribed other? Is it something like an indeterminate and non-circular ascription of an essence on oneself that arises from the ascribed otherness of minority? Now this is what the science of man creates as a certain insufficient way of constructing a notion about oneself by throwing itself open to an ascribed notion of minority. Lowell very well understands this process as something anthropological, which is not able to break the unitary prejudices, and it creates a certain biography of the solitary man. The biography of the solitary self is written from outside as this solitary man looks outside and looks for an ascribed other who provides the necessary ground of being, the necessary narrative input to develop a certain sense of self. And this is a kind of a technique of self-making. And this technique of self-making is an act of predication, an act of description. And this act of predication imbricates, involves, and encapsulates within itself the possible social categories, such as gender, such as a special predicate of being within a certain stereotype, which is a special mode of predication. So stereotyping the other is a special mode of predication. One can think about several transgendered identities. One can think about non-binary personhood. One can think about the stereotypical faithful believer who is different than oneself. So there are these layers of moods that minoritizes a certain identity by way of an ascriptive difference. And this is what the biography of a solitary man is all about. And this is a kind of special mode of predication. It's nothing but a certain kind of objectification. It's also a certain kind of absolutization as subject. And it is a certain inherent mode of creating a self based on a certain position, subjectivity, of the minority. So therefore, it's a sense of the real that devolves into this kind of an ascribed notion of minority, which is something pre-ontological, which is something prior to the very idea of individuality, the very idea of selfhood. So, description of minorityhood assumes a certain priority over the notion of selfhood. And this kind of a philosophical pre-calculation, this kind of a speculative description of otherness, this kind of a plenitude of predication, this kind of a special mode of predication, and this kind of othering the other in the form of a minority is necessarily insufficient to think of a collective self. It can only result into the notion of solitude, the notion of the biography of a solitary human who is looking for a recognition by way of othering, a solitary human who is trying to expand his or her consciousness by way of connecting that consciousness to a certain stereotypical notion of minority. So therefore, broadly, the biography of an ordinary man, is a description of an experience that creates others as minorities. And this modality of creating others as minorities is also embedded in a kind of power relation where the minorities as entities are supposed to be dispersed in a chain of power relations. And this minority is never given an ontological weight. It is only a kind of ascription, an ascription that creates certain spaces in relation to which one constitutes oneself. So therefore, it's a kind of a inverted relationality that produces the very sense of the self within the modern hierarchical state structure. So this also very ironically gives rise to what Laurellean has called as the humanity principle. Humanity principle is something like language principle, something like the pleasure principle. It's all under the name of ordinary human, that a certain principle of humanity, a certain principle of thinking necessarily, a certain relational structure that empties itself by inverting from the ascribed minorityhood of the other to a constituted self. And that constituted self assumes a certain kind of identity, which is a principle that works through philosophy, but at the same time, it also exposes the insufficiency of the very science of human. So the humanity principle, the pleasure principle, the principle of minoritization by way of an ascribed otherness is to fill up a certain vacancy in one's self-consciousness. And this is a reverse relationality, a reverse intentionality that Laurellean talks about, as opposed to a certain kind of naivety about one's own self as independent, as separated in a Cartesian sense from such ascribed otherness of minorities. So the way the self is conceptualized by a naive ordinary man, you know, is by a certain kind of transcendental illusion, the illusion of the self as a knower, the illusion of self as a subject, the illusion of self knowing the very process of constitution of the self. And here comes an important point, that self can never be aware of its own constitution, except that the awareness comes in the form of a self that arises from an external source of ascribed otherness of the minority. So therefore, now we'll say that it's not at all logical. Rather, it's a kind of a concoction. It's a kind of a phantasm, sometimes ideal, sometimes empirical. And it moves between the relative and the absolute, and it offers itself to a variety of interpretations. So this is a kind of absolutist idealist mixture of a hypothetical real with the experience of the real. Now, how to distinguish between the hypothetical real and the experience of the real? Can we have a set of superior praxis or technicality to draw this distinction between that which is hypothetically real, which is hypothesizing the notion of a minority, and that which is real in the emptiness of the self? How to draw a distinction between the two? As Lowell says, a distinction is highly impossible, implausible, because it always necessarily remains a kind of a realist, absolutist mixture. And this mixture refuses a clear-cut normative definition of oneself as opposed to another. So it's a kind of a heteronormativity that separates the self from the other. And this heteronormativity mobilizes a lot of external markers like territory, culture, language, religion, and all other such social categories in order to constitute a notion of minority that would ultimately promise but won't deliver a notion of self to someone who is hypothesizing. Now, this interesting gap between a hypothesized sense of reality constituted by an ascribed otherness of the minority and an experience of the real in the sense of an empty notion of self, in the form of what Laurellean has called a movement from other to the self, a reverse relationality, a reverse intentionality, is something which only creates stakes. It creates stakes. It creates claims. It creates a contemplative world about how one discovers oneself. So it's all in the tone of speculation that one creates oneself. And that's what is a biography of the solitary man that he talks about. Now, the question of authority is another question. As I said, the subtitle of the book is Of Authorities and Minorities. So the question comes, who is an authority? That's an important question. Who can be considered as someone who can author the individuality of the individual. Who is it who authors the individuality? Is it the individual who authors individuality? Or is it a certain force of authority that constitutes the notion of individuality, and that which constitutes the notion of individuality acts as an authority? Well, the answer is rather Heideggerian and Kantian in Laurel. Laurel doesn't desist from providing a Heideggerian answer. And a Heideggerian answer necessarily moves towards a certain inauthentic notion of oneself. It can never discover an authentic notion of oneself, and probably the idea of authority assumes itself as an authentic notion of oneself. The moment one is able to conceptualize an authentic notion of oneself, and this authenticity is bereft of an ascribed notion of otherness. While we have seen this difficulty of assuming authenticity without an ascribed notion of otherness, that makes life very, very difficult. The biography of the ordinary man is supposed to conceptualize the idea of authenticity, the idea of authority. So Laurel asked this question in chapter 2 of the book. Who are the authorities? That's an important question for Laurel. And Laurel begins on to say, the authority is grown from the world. It's just grown from the world. It's derived from the world. The authority is derived from the world. It's derived from a certain description about oneself. So authority is subsidiary to the description that one gives to oneself. And if it is an empty description, by way of ascribing otherness to the minority, it's something that is not really created in the form of what we consider as authoritative, such as language, power, or identity, or will, meaning, etc. So the entire set of philosophical logos that surrounds the notion of authority and that looks for an authentic notion of the self is derived from the world, and that which is derived from the world, is not self-reliant, is not something that can create a centered notion of self. It can only move towards a decentered notion of being. And this decentered notion of being creates a sense of exile, a sense of unhomeliness, a sense of non-belonging to the world from where it is derived. So therefore, the idea of authority, Laurel points out, is something that is indeterminate, something that is affected by the impossibility of overcoming the Cartesian difference between the self and the other. And Laurel would say that ultimately the idea of authority, the idea of authenticity, would be something that is finite, something that has done away with its own emptiness, its own sense of unbelonging. But how does one do away with the sense of unbelonging? Is an alarming proposition, and it creates a variety of imaginaries. One of the imaginary that this alarming proposition of giving up one's own emptiness creates is an idea of integration. An idea of integration that sits in the middle of hierarchization and that tries to construct the spread of the sense of difference. And therefore, it moves towards a certain level of articulation and appropriation and expropriation, which would mean that a notion of self is merely articulated. A notion of self appropriates an assumed sense of authority, and it throws open an idea of authenticity, as if authenticity is something that is embedded in the very notion of an emptied out self. All of which, again, is non circular, and therefore it creates a kind of philosophical disjunction between the self and the other, which is different from what originally was a Cartesian disjunction, now turns itself into a philosophical, a metaphysical disjunction between the self and the other, by way of being affected by a certain impossibility, a certain implausibility, which could be best expressed by saying that the notion of self cannot be expressed without an ascribed notion of minority, with which I started my talk. So it all moves towards a kind of culturalist attribution. And culturalist attribution is something external. It's not internal to a society. It's not internal to the formation of the self. Because an ascribed otherness of the minority and an external sense of non-belonging, or an external sense of difference, or an externally attributed sense of otherness. Now, all these are part of an outside, part of an exterior. So therefore, a deeply rooted cultural self is an imagined, hypothetical reality that throws open the idea of an exterior and outside notion of authenticity, which is ascribed on the other, from which it tries to return to itself in the form of a biographical capture, in the form of certain events of life, which are part of, once again, part of culturalist attributions, which result into a certain sense of integrating oneself with an outside. So neither the integrated self is authentic, nor the outside with which it has integrated itself is authentic. And this sense of inauthenticity is something which is driven towards a certain kind of subjectivity, which is without an object. A subjectivity which is without an object sees the object in the other, sees the object in the ascribed minority, and it brushes aside its own self-experience, its own awareness of itself. So by brushing aside its own awareness of itself, it emphasizes on an outside, which is an ascribed otherness of minorityhood, which is a subject without an object. So one can see here an emptying out process of subjectivity. An emptying out process of subjectivity that cannot conceive of an ideal order, that can only keeps itself away, keeps itself apart or remote from the external objectivity or externally ascribed idea of being a minority, creating an absolute sense of transcendence in oneself. a sense of transcendence that doesn't really create a sense of self. So this kind of a transcendence is something that opens up the notion of self to an infinity. And there is a kind of a reordering of this sense of inauthenticity, this sense of movement towards infinity, in terms of some kind of biographical understanding of where one is located and how one ascribes and thinks about the other. So how does one think about the other? It remains an important question in this description of minorityhood. And this description of minorityhood creates a sense of hyphenation, a sense of simultaneous relationship and separation, a sense of conjoined state of existence and a disjointed sense of authenticity. Now this is what is best expressed in the form of a notion of citizenship. The notion of citizenship, which is supposed to be an absolute preserve of authenticity, is now transfigured, is now transposed onto a notion of minority, a minority whose citizenship is subjected to a kind of procedural testing. A procedural testing which is largely biometric, which turns the process of procedural testing into a question of right to have rights, as Hannah Arendt would say. So, right to have rights is a kind of an ascription of otherness, which is ascribed to a minority. While this minority is subjected to a procedure of testing its own authenticity in terms of birth, in terms of territory, affiliation, culture, etc., in a manner that institutionally this minority always remains fixed into a sense of inauthenticity. So this ascription of otherness to the minority creates a sense of inauthenticity in the core notion of an authentic citizenship, in a manner that citizenship can no longer be an authentic marker of one's self-identity. The case of Assam's NRC, where the basic presupposition has been a proof that one is not an immigrant from an outside country, and a proof that one is born at a certain period of certain parents and enjoys a certain lineage, a certain kind of a legacy on the one hand, and on the other, a proof that one is not an alien and one is a kind of an original inhabitant of a certain place. You can see here the contrarian positions between ascribing citizenship by birth, ascribing citizenship by way of belonging to a community or to a place, and also wholesale testing of the proof about citizenship, and thereby dispersing it to a kind of a generalized inauthenticity until someone is proven to be a citizen, which is reversing the principle of natural justice, which goes by this saying that one is innocent unless proven guilty. And here one remains on the border of being a citizen and a non-citizen until one is proven to be a citizen. It's not the case that one is a citizen unless one is proven to be a non-citizen. It's creating a certain binary between the citizen and the non-citizen, and at the same time blurring the distinction between citizen and non-citizen by way of producing a presupposed sense of authenticity in a certain kind of proof, which by itself is no guarantee that one would be deemed to be uh, an authentic citizen, as the case is in case of Assam. Even after NRC list has been published, and more than 3 crore people are qualified to be included in the list. What is being talked about is the border districts, which are supposed to have a lot of aliens, while surprisingly, a larger number of people got included in the border districts of Assam, and thereby throwing open and projecting a notion of a porous border, which is open to a cross-country migration and open to illegal immigration, is questioning the very sense of authenticity of citizenship, the very sense of the borderline, and the very sense of proving one's own citizenship as something authentic. So the biography of an ordinary man who ends up in a detention camp by not being able to prove one's citizenship is all because of absence of a certain narrative from one's life, a narrative which could be evidenced by a set of papers and their non-availability, in spite of the very fact that one has grown in the country and born in the country. One ends up in a detention camp, and one is fixated and ascribed with the notion of being a minority there.
Sir,
So you can see here that
sir,
minority.
this is,
Yeah, sure.
yes,
Anything?
sir, this is a gentle reminder, sir.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
concluding my talk.
yes, yes, thank you.
So this notion of ascribed minorityhood by way of reducing the authenticity of the notion of self-identity in order to ascribe minorityhood in someone else and to take away the very notion of authenticity of citizenship is something that brings out the empty notion of the biography of an ordinary man, as it happened in case of Bengal. I think I stop here. I could have gone to a few other propositions, but because of dearth of time, myself being delayed, I apologize once again, and also sincerely thank you for listening. That's it. Thank you for the moment.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. And really, I speak from the core of my heart. It is really wonderful. Dr. Biswas has pointed out the notion of reflexive minority, fixing minority, transcendental fixity of minority, Eurocentrism, binarism, dualism, stereotyping, and all those things. And I hope all these concepts are really very crucial in order to understand the topic that he has delivered today. And now we are going to the second part of this lecture, that is the question answer session. Okay, as we have another session. So I would like to request our participants would like to take 1 or 2 questions. If you have other questions, definitely you can type the question in the chat box. We'll forward the question to the speaker, and he will answer the question. Okay, he will discuss.
That modality.
So, over to you, over to the audience. Please, if you have any question or 2 questions that we will take.
Wrong. Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Dear participants, if you have any question, then you can unmute yourselves and raise your question to our respected speaker. If not right now, then you can forward the question to us, and we'll forward the question to our speaker. I think, sir, our participants, they are thinking, and they will
Sure.
they will forward the question to us, and
Okay.
we'll forward the same to you.
Sure. Fantastic. Yes.
Okay.
No problem.
Thank you, sir. Thank you once again. So I am now forwarding, and I'm now handing over the session to Muhammadul Hassan Dhabuk. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bapin. So, I am Muhammadul Hassan Bhabuk, uh, Assistant General Secretary of BASE. It's my privilege to deliver vote of thanks of the plenary one of 3-day virtual conference on belongingness and homelessness. So, as Bapin said, that Dr. Viswas' deliverance is excellence and were enlightened and overwhelming. So, yes, Dr. Viswas provides a complete different understanding of minorityhood, self, and other individuality and authority from a different philosophical dimension. And his scholarship and deep understanding of notion of minority enlighten us, shows us a new way to rethink, reimagining, and re-examining the concept of minority. So my heartfelt thanks goes to Dr. Biswas for his fantastic deliberation. So and again, I like to thanks all the audience. Uh, uh, and I am not taking much time because we have another session, plenary session. So thank you, sir, for
My
joining with.
gratitude to all of you. I take your leave for now. We'll remain in touch. Thank you all.
Okay, okay. Thank you, sir.